For me, when we talk about a topic, I don't know what it is, but it's easier for me to talk about what gets in the way, right? Because I think
Yeah.
because I think that those are the things that are always up for us, right? I think we understand often, the benefits that can come from being authentic and from being vulnerable. I mean, we understand the necessity, I think, uh, for those things, for connection. But then it's those things that get in the way. Those are the things that are like, yeah, but even though I talked about comparison, I think for me, it's the uncertainty. I think that is for me in my own experience, the thing that is really up. And I think
Mhm.
maybe that just kind of encompasses a lot of things, right? It's like, I want to do the thing, but I'm not sure what's going to happen. It does get in the way when when we think that we can control every reaction and every outcome as a result of what we do. We lose ourselves in that, right? Because then if we're so caught up in that being uncertain, it becomes paralyzing. At least for me, it does.
I'll just say, I think I have a lot more experience with the things that get in the way than
Maybe that's
than
it. Maybe
familiarity
that's
with like the actual thing, right? Like
maybe that's it.
I know those a whole lot better.
Because
Yeah,
we live them,
and I think
right? Yeah.
yeah, when we first started looking at this list of these top 3 things or whatever we're calling them, um, fear seemed like the obvious, like, oh yeah, that's definitely number one that gets in the way. And maybe in a way, like fear is the thing that underrides like all of the other, like
Yeah.
whatever else. Fear might be but yeah, I think uncertainty in and of itself is a whole spectrum. Like there is a whole spectrum of experience of uncertainty, and there's like uncertainty that is so like absolutely not, like there's so much fear around a thing, or uncertainty is like, well, I don't know, I've never done this before, and doing that new thing is a little weird, and like I'm not really sure. And so even just the hesitation of uncertainty, like I think it goes from that tiny moment of hesitation all the way through like pausing, stopping dead in our tracks, like absolutely not, no way, because that is nope, not doing that thing. There's like that
Mhm.
is so scary, or that's so unknown, or whatever the experience of it is. um I think uncertainty is like the catalyst for us not engaging in vulnerability. Like I think that may
Yeah.
be, I don't know, maybe that's just me. Maybe it is like the number one thing, right? Like if I knew what would happen in any moment of vulnerability, yeah, I'd sure do it. But then we're
But
not
then
being
there'd be no
vulnerable.
need to be vulnerable, right?
Right. And
There'd be no
that's
need to be vulnerable.
yeah,
Yeah.
kind
I
of
think that
fascinating.
comparison is the up and comer though, right? Because I don't know, it seems like comparison is kind of like been in the background. You look at how the ways that we're connected throughout the world, social media and just all sorts of this, how we can literally see people's lives in ways that, 20
Or at
years
least what they
ago,
want us
people.
to see of their life.
Right, right. But what I'm getting to that point is like, more so than like 20 years ago. Like, I don't
Oh
know what
yeah.
you're eating. Like 20 years ago, I don't even care. I don't really care what you're eating now.
I don't
But,
care now. Yeah.
um, but so like everything is so like in our awareness. But what we don't think about is it is a packaged reality. This packaged
Yeah.
reality is in our awareness, and I think,
Mm.
um, and so then we begin to compare our own reality to this packaged version of reality, and we see it as the same thing, right? And
Yeah.
so I think then that comparison is like, "Oh, I would love to step out and do this, but I'm not as good as that person, or I
Yeah.
wouldn't be able to do it like that or like this." Then we start having this different experience because then it's like this limiting kind of blanket experience because if we can't be that like that person,
Yeah.
then we're just not gonna do it. Or if
Yeah.
and I think that does keep us playing small, which is a part of this conversation of vulnerability, right? Because the
Yeah.
vulnerability is maybe stepping out in a new way, a big way, a different way, or revealing ourselves in a way that we haven't before. We're not gonna get rid of that. That's how our brains work, right?
Yeah.
This, that, here, there, good, bad, safe, unsafe, all those categories. But then the trick is not to, like, live always from those categories.
To be aware enough of our own story, nonsense, thoughts, whatever, to just know, like, oh,
Nonsense
I'm
thoughts. Yeah.
our nonsense thoughts. Yeah, to not act from that space, or to recognize, I mean, whatever the process is for each one of us, of just recognizing our own process, our own thoughts, our own way of being, and not right. This comment, I was literally like, as you were talking, I was like, there's, yes, what are the words to say this thought? And poof, this comment came into the
Yeah.
chat. And so thank you, Chris. Absolutely. Yeah. Like, and I think even prior to social media, that there was this, like, the story that we make up about somebody else's life based on, like, the 10 or 20% of their life that we see,
Right.
we're comparing to 100% of our experience. So we don't see the other, like, 85 to 90% of that person's life that is probably not like the story that we made up about the 10 to 15%, right? And I totally recognize that, like, seeing the person who's out there doing the thing that I thought I wanted to do in the past, and going like, oh my God, they're so amazing, and it's perfect. And I put them up on this pedestal. I think we all do this to some extent somewhere. And then when we go to try and do the thing, we don't know that they kept at it for 50 years before it happened, or
Right.
that they struggle with it on a daily basis, or they have imposter syndrome or whatever. Like, we don't know all that. And so we just compare to the perfect story version that we created. Meanwhile, they're human too. They're going through all the same stuff or similar stuff that anyone else is going through about whatever they're trying to do. I think social media has just kind of, like, turn that into a software program. Like, it's just demonstrating that in much closer proximity.
If you even look at how we do this show, like we have the behind the scenes where it's all the things, all the little,
Right.
here and there and hits and
And then we
bangs
cut
off
all
the
those out.
microphone, all the things. Oh, we're gonna cut all that out. We're gonna package. Look at us. We did
Yeah.
it perfectly with no mistake. But it's very interesting that the very intertwining of this conversation that we had last month and this month, this authenticity and vulnerability conversation, because isn't that what we want to do? We want to put all the parts of ourselves that are, the bright and shiny, and then, put in a corner or in a closet all the things we'd rather people not see. It's the same thing with vulnerability, right? That's
Yeah.
the hard thing. And so I think vulnerability becomes that kind of bringing the willingness and beginning to bring those things out of the closet and to express them. So then vulnerability becomes the birthplace of authenticity, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it is that kind of flipping the inside out in the way that is, serving connection and serving those healthy relationships with others. The conversation kind of goes around to those things that we want to hide, but those are the things that actually hiding is what actually limits our ability to be vulnerable and also impacts our authenticity and how we show up. Like we've talked about before, and I think any conversation that we talk about authenticity and vulnerability, we have to also put the caveat that this is not always safe for people in our current society and framework and current world sort of system, all sorts of societies and frameworks. There are spaces and places that are not safe for people to be authentic and vulnerable. And I think that too is a spotlight of like, oh, look here. If this um, group of individuals cannot be vulnerable and authentic for who they are, this is a spotlight that we need to look at. Do we need to do to change the thing that underlies that, right? And I think that we're seeing that. Oh my God, we're seeing that more and more. This highlight of spaces and places where people aren't safe, and what can we begin to do to change that?
Like
Um,
physically not safe,
oh
like life
yes,
and
yes.
danger not safe. It's interesting. Like, we say, like, there's an emotional risk in being vulnerable. And the other
Mhm.
night in our weekly gathering, this kind of came up. It's almost like it needs another word, like, because there's vulnerable, as in, like, being vulnerable in a space that is unsafe, to, like, physically unsafe to be vulnerable. For me, that falls more into, like, a little bit of, like, the traditional definition of, like, putting ourselves in a vulnerable state of, like,
Right.
if I show up this way, if I show up open and authentic as me in this place, that could be physically dangerous, life-threatening, which has a very different feel and energy to it than I'm in a relationship with somebody and I'm trying to express these very deep places of me, and I'm not sure how they're going to take it. In a place where I'm like, they're not going to physically harm me,
Right.
but their authentic reaction in the moment may be something that feels damaging. I don't know if it needs a different word or just conversation enough to talk about the different distinctions or
Just an
something. Or
awareness.
like, yeah.
Even like regardless of the level or the expression of the spectrum of vulnerability that we're talking about, I think that the one thing underneath it all is the awareness that without the ability to be vulnerable and authentic, there is not true connection in
Mm,
on any level that we're talking about
yeah.
vulnerability. And so, if we are looking at wanting to create a world where auth- um, connection and belonging and community and all the things that come from that support, that I don't know, that collective being there for one another, that and we've all been in those spaces, and it feels good. If we want to create that on a global level, then I think there's an awareness that we need to do a lot of looking on all different levels of vulnerability, because we are not currently creating spaces where that is true across the board. And so
Yeah.
I think that um that's the one thing, that if that is the world that we want to see, and the interactions and the frameworks that we want to see, then we have to look at, I mean, just at the base level of this vulnerability conversation, of the spaces and places where people feel physically unsafe, and what are the things that fuel the creation of those sorts of environments, and then directly speak to the things that are creating those things that we don't want to see.
What's coming up for me too about this is like the flipped perspective of, if you are someone whose whose vulnerability feels threatened by someone else showing up authentically, right? So like we're talking about the
That's
person
a
who,
red flag, isn't it?
yeah, right. So like so I think so far we've been talking about the person who is like the odd person out showing up in a group where it may be unsafe for them to be authentic and vulnerable. And so I think there are definitely places where like we need to be smart about where we're choosing to be our most authentic, most vulnerable. And so I think we do, in places that are not safe, need to be vigilant, right? But also from the perspective of that group. Now, like, let's look at that, right? From the flip perspective, if an individual shows up in your group and the hint of their authenticity, the hint of their vulnerability, of them being different than the rest of the group, if that triggers your feelings of, if that feels like it infringes on your ability for you to be this group or whatever, like, I think we need to start looking at that, looking at like, wait a minute. Why would this one person feel so threatening to me and this group, when clearly the power dynamic in that situation is like the group has a large influence on how that group situation is going to go, right? That also plays out in other places for all of us to some degree. Like, to some degree, like somebody's going to show up somewhere, maybe it's a one-on-one, where their authenticity feels like a threat to our authenticity or vulnerability. I think we need to stop pointing a finger at that other person. And I think that's like the societal norm, is like, oh, this person showed up in a way that I'm not okay with. And like yes, there are times where we need to have a conversation and say, hey, maybe that's not okay. But also, if I'm feeling a certain way, that's not up to the other person. That's up to me. Like, how am I feeling about my ability to be authentic and vulnerable because of how I responded or reacted to this other person? And
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of nuance to this conversation, because it's never just one. It's not just, oh, I need to take responsibility for the whole thing, because we are in a relationship here in some way. We are connecting in some way or disconnecting in some way. And so it's more than just me, it's us. But I think there's like that flipped side of the perspective that I don't
Yeah.
know is often talked about. Like there is a certain level of responsibility that needs to be taken. I can't just be like, I'm creating and living and screw you. Like we do have that
Well,
responsibility for other people.
yeah. Well, and I think too, and I think this comes up, it has come up in previous conversations of authenticity and vulnerability, and we talked about boundaries. But I think even more than boundaries is that level of vulnerability that is the goal is, to connect and to be seen and things. Not everyone, I'm gonna just say it, for me, not everyone's a safe space to do that. You kinda have to earn that, right? It comes from a relationship and a thing and a back and forth, right? And so I'm gonna set boundaries around how vulnerable I'm gonna be based on our interactions, right? And so this is not, when we talk about, be vulnerable and this is it's not all right, we're just gonna just kind of spew it everywhere, right? Or just kind of like be vulnerable in every sort of situation because no, there are situations where we have been injured or harmed or emotionally um injured and harmed, and
Yeah.
right, we're not gonna go back to those situations and then be vulnerable. That person or that situation has not earned the right for our vulnerability, for connection and belonging. Vulnerability and authenticity are like these key ingredients for those things. And if connection and belonging is what we're looking for, then we have to add the ingredients, right? And then this conversation begins the process of how do we actually use those ingredients in a way that
Yeah.
works for us.
I think my takeaway today is two things. One, the general conversation about vulnerability, I think, is we have to be brave enough to embrace vulnerability in safe places with people who are safe to
Mhm.
do that. And so for us, the one trying to be vulnerable or wanting for us, I don't think we're not like, oh, I'm going to try and be vulnerable today. Like for us trying to access that deeper connection, that deeper relationship would require us to embrace, that next level of vulnerability. And I think that's like, oh, okay, doing that in places where it's safe to do that,
Yes.
kind of just testing that building that sense of trust. I think the other takeaway for me is then, am I, and this is a question for every one of us to ask ourselves, am I a safe place where other people
Mhm.
can feel like they can show up vulnerably and for us to connect? And
Yeah.
are we going to be that for everybody? Probably not. But are we that for somebody? Are you that for anybody? Right? Like I think
Right.
I think there are a lot of people who have been um, a product of society that says you are not to be vulnerable, you are not to be authentic, you are to put on a mask, don't show anybody anything, and keep it all pressed down inside. And I don't know that ever worked. I think we're seeing the outpicturing of how that definitely doesn't work now. And
Yeah.
so I think we do need to all embrace, right? And so am I a place where somebody can show up and be vulnerable?
That's the homework,
Yeah.
everyone.
Yes. Yeah.
Ask and explore that question.
Yeah. And not to beat yourself up about it, but to
Yeah.
be honest and like, hey, life has shown us a lot of things and not all of it is necessarily true or accurate or good advice. Well, thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Truth Be Told 2.0. This month we are exploring vulnerability and the broad sweeping strokes of vulnerability, but also some of the nuance. What is the power of vulnerability and how does that lead us to deeper connections? And so we're in week 2 and it's already proving to be an amazing conversation. In your safe and brave spaces, please attempt being vulnerable, a little more vulnerable than you were before. So thanks for checking out this. If you were interested in more of this kind of conversation, you can join The Gathering on Thursday nights, and that is a weekly event. You can check that out on our website, soulevolutioncollaborative.org/events. It's all the information is there about it. And while you're there, poke around. There's a lot of other really amazing information on soulevolutioncollaborative.org for you that is life-changing, offering possibilities for doing life in a new and maybe different way. So thanks for tuning in. If we don't see you Thursday, we will see you here next week at Truth Be Told 2.0.